Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the San Francisco Classical Voice Virtual Greenroom with John Adams and Elkhanah Pulitzer. We thank you both for being here and welcome everyone listening in. I'm Steven Winn. I'm delighted to be hosting this conversation. I'll try to stay out of it as much as possible. We're here to talk about this prodigious production of Antony and Cleopatra that opened at the Opera House just four days ago. Let's talk first about Shakespeare. I mean, certainly you are not the first composers and lyricists, librettists to take on Shakespeare. Verdi famously, of course, with Macbeth and Falstaff and Othello, several Hamlets. There was a Lear done here back in the 80s, a Rebut Ryman's Lear, Kiss Me Kate, West Side Story, and an Antony and Cleopatra, which preceded your own. And in a funny way, there's a kind of parallel that Samuel Barber, Antony and Cleopatra, opened the Metropolitan Opera House in 1966, the new Opera House at Lincoln Center. And this Antony and Cleopatra opens the 100th season of San Francisco Opera. So there's a real sense of celebration. Let's talk first about when and how the idea of opening this season with a Shakespeare opera written by you, John, and Elkhanah, directing and script consulting. When and how did the idea get started?
In the last opera that I did, Girls of the Golden West, which was about the California gold rush, we discovered in our research that a popular form of entertainment during that period was reciting Shakespeare. So Peter Sellers and I had the idea of setting a couple of very small scenes from Macbeth, which seemed to go well for the tone of
the dire deeds of the gold rush. Huh?
That's right, yeah. And I just found that setting Shakespeare was a dream for me. You know, I'd set several times. I've set John Donne, and of course Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So Matthew Schildbach came to me. This is right about the same time as Girls of the Golden West, so that would be 2017, and asked if I would write an opera for the centennial season. And I said yes, and I would like to do a Shakespeare opera, and I know exactly which opera it is, which play it is, which is Antony and Cleopatra. Of course, I was aware of the fact that Samuel Barber had already composed his own version of that story, and I also was aware of the fact that it was apparently not a very successful premiere. So I knew that I had that, you know, I had that millstone to carry on my back, and I knew that that would be the first question I'd be asked. But I love the play, and I didn't think any composer could own a particular play any more than anybody could own Faust or Romeo and Juliet, you know, or you know, Ulysses. And that was the, you know, that was the beginning idea. And Elkhanah we'd already worked together several times. We'd done a wonderful Nixon in China with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and she was just brilliant. It was funny and touching and very creative and imaginative. And she also did staged my oratorio, Gospel According to the Other Mary, with the San Francisco Symphony. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to work together.
Sounds like you were waiting to be asked to the prom. You had Antony and Cleopatra in your toolkit ready to go, and you just needed someone. Had you thought of other Shakespeare operas that I mean Shakespeare plays that seemed inviting to you? And
well, Othello, but somebody else had written an opera to that. I can't remember who it was.
Yeah, somebody come to mind there.
You know, an interesting thing was that during the pandemic, I had this great opportunity to be home alone here in my home in Berkeley for about 18 months. You know, like every other performing artist, I had all my conducting gigs canceled. So one of the projects I had was to finally learn Italian. And of course, that opened up a whole world to me because I could understand the libretti that Boito and Verdi created, and it was particularly this Falstaff libretto, which really just jazzed me, got me so excited. So that was a very important part of the process of writing Antony and Cleopatra.
We should note, by the way, that the libretto includes text from other sources, including Plutarch and Virgil, and a Dryden translation of the Aeneid in one spot. Tell me about that process. I guess Elkhanah was very involved in helping to cobble this. Maybe that's a coarse term for it, to construct this libretto.
Yes. Well, I don't want to frighten your viewers, those who haven't come to the opera, because when you list all these things, it sounds like a reading list for a really
homework. Oh no,
homework. But no, it's mostly Shakespeare. I found that I needed something for Caesar to express the manifest destiny, this sort of juggernaut of Rome taking over the world, the way Putin had hoped he could take over Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't an extended piece in the Shakespeare play, so I went to the Aeneid, to two sections in the Aeneid, book 6 and book 10, and I wanted to use a wonderful translation by Robert Fitzgerald, a contemporary poet, but it didn't fit with the Shakespeare. So I went back to John Dryden and used that. But I will confess, I seriously mangled that in order to, twist and massage it so that it would be right for the moment.
The Dryden scholars will be all over you. Elkhanah, when John proposed this idea to you, what was your initial take, and how did you sort of get your mind wrapped around this and start to think about how this might come to be a stage opera?
Well, I mean, my first response was, thrilled at the prospect of collaborating, particularly on a new piece with John. And I mean, we talked a bit about just sort of what our history with Shakespeare had been up to that point, and then also associations with Cleopatra and sort of how she lives in the imagination. And from there it was pretty much, let's dive in and look at the play and start really looking at the arc and figure out how to shake down, as you say, this huge piece with lots of scenes and lots of bouncing back and forth, and the draw to Shakespeare as subject, and Antony and Cleopatra in particular, profoundly resonates for me, because the idea of telling stories that are timeless and profoundly intimate as well as epic, and that have shaped our history as human beings, all those touchstones felt like it just was, big and juicy and well worth grappling with.
I guess you both sort of pre-answered this question, but is there any sense in which Shakespeare is a daunting thing to undertake? That can we measure up to the great verse and the great characters and the great the great art that it is? Is there any sense of healthful fear and trepidation about it? Or?
My quick answer is yes. What about you, John?
I didn't worry about it. I was so grateful for the language. And, at one of our very first staging rehearsals way back, early August, we had all the cast sitting around looking at the libretto, and Gerald Finley, our marvelous Antony, just suddenly he just started talking about how wonderful it was to be able to sing these words. He didn't even say this text, he said these words. And That's exactly how I felt, that it was a privilege and a delight and a pleasure. And, since the premiere, there've been a little bit of whining from critics and some people online. Oh, it's so difficult to follow, the language. But, so's Tristan. So's Falstaff. You do your homework first. And I think there's very little in our libretto that is not immediately comprehensible. There are a couple of lines where even I think, oh, what did that mean? I've already forgotten. There are a few things that are pretty obscure, but I think that in the end, this libretto is eminently accessible. And if anything is a little puzzling, all you have to do is look at Elkhanah's staging or listen to the music and you get it.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly get to that, the extraordinary stagecraft of this production. But John, in your note in the program, you say something interesting about setting verse, that your sort of inclinations and your sort of grounding is less in classical opera tradition setting verse, even when you're setting someone like John Donne or Shakespeare, than it is in sort of the American sort of song idiom. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. It's a fascinating idea. I wonder if you could kind of dig down on that a little bit.
Well, I'm an American, and when I go to England, I'm intensely aware of the way people speak, the way they use the language. If I listen to Benjamin Britten or Elgar, I understand, the stance from which that setting of text has originated, but it doesn't interest me. I don't want my singers to sound like Handel or Benjamin Britten. I think it's largely because I grew up like everybody else in this country. I grew up listening to pop music. Okay, so I listened to pop music from 50 years ago or 40 years ago, but we're all very influenced by the pop milieu that we live in. And if you listen to the great American songwriters, what we call the American songbook, whether it's Ella Fitzgerald or Billie Holiday or Stevie Wonder or Joni Mitchell or on and on and on, the way in which the English language fits like hand in glove into the melodies, that's what really is the source of how I approach setting.
Yeah, I dip down anywhere in this libretto and you see this just luscious language, and it's Act 2, Scene 3, Antony. Sometimes we see a cloud that's dragonish, a vapor sometimes like a bear, a towered citadel, a pendant rock, a forked mountain or blue promontory. I mean, there's just music in those lines right away, isn't there, throughout the libretto, throughout the play?
Well, that's beautiful the way you read that, Stephen, but I think Jerry Finley even does it better.
I bow to him humbly and eagerly.
Yeah, it's, what can I say? I think if somebody's a living poet today or a novelist, to have Shakespeare, they feel the same way I feel, when I listen to Beethoven. It's like, it's so great. What's the point trying to do anything after that?
Yeah.
But for me, the attraction is threefold. First of all, it's the beauty of the language itself. Secondly, it's the rhythm of the language, which is so extraordinary. Every line suggests a musical shape to me. I never had any trouble finding melodic material because the Shakespeare, the constellation of rhythms and the form is so potent. And the third thing, of course, is the deep psychological knowledge behind every phrase, that Shakespeare is the great psychologist. So, I almost can't imagine doing another opera without it being Shakespeare. Don't worry, I don't think I will, but I feel so spoiled by this.
Well, who knows? Well, that's a good segue, because I wanted to talk about these characters. We've been talking about verse and setting of verse and Shakespeare and his creating large things to large gestures, musical and dramatic, go along with them. But let's talk about the three really sort of main characters of the opera, which seems, by the way, seems to have a cast of thousands and must have another cast of thousands backstage to execute the stagecraft. But Elkhanah, you cite that famous phrase about Cleopatra, the infinite variety of Cleopatra. Tell me about the allure of her. Let's start with her.
Well, sure. I mean, she's, she claimed to be Isis incarnate, so she was associated with divine rulership, and marks the end of the whole Ptolemaic rule in Egypt, and ultimately Egypt's collapse in terms of autonomy. And as a sort of iconic figure, I mean, if you look at history and how many women rulers there were of note, there aren't very many. It's quite a short list. So to be able to grapple, one of those historical figures is phenomenal in a man's world. And then also all of this sort of iconography that's come out over 2,000 plus years about her, from hieroglyphs down to soap boxes and cigarette cases, that are still printing images of Cleopatra. Halle Berry at the Super Bowl, dressed up as Cleopatra. So she's alive and well and kicking in our greater imagination. And that's what was really appealing about tackling her as a subject. I also loved DeMille's Cleopatra, in terms of sort of all of the various depictions of her, famously Theda Bara, all the way to Elizabeth, winking at the camera, which was high kitsch. So there's all that associative background, and in this sort of more postmodern world, looking at all of those facets and manifestations that Spark still was really the kernel of my way into the project, I would say.
Did you and John talk early on about those kind of the way in which Cleopatra remains, as you say, has remained so vivid in the culture for millennia now? Was that something that was sort of first principles for you about how to open up this character and how to find this character?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the really early conversations that we had that I still recall fondly was, John, I think it was the book called West of Eden that you recommended, that was sort of about the sort of sad and painful, complicated underbelly of a lot of the famous Hollywood families. Norton Simon is in there, and like some of these kids of these real sort of Hollywood royalty are like jumping off of buildings and, getting put into clinics and stuff like that. So this sort of toggling between the public and private, and the sort of veneer of the lifestyles of the rich and famous versus the true complexity and pain that lives in any, person's struggles, was, I would say, a part of the really early conversations.
One of the things that you discovered in looking closely at the Shakespeare play is that many, if not most, of the scenes are things that occur in private. There's a kind of intimacy to the play, in spite of its grandeur, its political and ideological scope. It's really an intimately drawn story in many ways, isn't it?
It is, and it's funny because any action that that has a personal ramification, right? All this sort of made about marrying a sister, breaking up, or going back to a lover, all those things have a sort of exponentially giant global impact in terms of how that manifests. So that was very compelling. And then, yeah, also again, this sort of what's beyond the mask of the public life and the personas of these people, and what gives them beating hearts and makes them fallible and real.
John, you've talked about the sort of psychological sort of modernity, the very, sense in which it's a very, relevant and resonant play for us now. To talk a little bit about that in terms of the characters, in terms of Cleopatra and Antony, and then of course Caesar, Octavian.
Well, this is, I've lost count, but I think this is my 9th stage work, if I count all my operas and my show and oratorio. So, I look back on all the critical reaction, and of course, we're every day there's some review coming out, and I was interested that several reviewers complained that Antony and Cleopatra spent much of this opera fighting, or another reviewer said, well, it just isn't as sexy as it ought to be. But what drew me to this story is that these are older lovers. Each has a very complex past. They're not Romeo and Juliet. They are in love, but life gets in the way, and they're forced to make difficult decisions. Antony marries, he goes to Rome and he marries Caesar's sister, and Cleopatra makes deals with Rome to stay alive and to keep her children from being murdered. And they fight. Act 2, there's just absolutely torrential violence, personal violence between the two of them. And it's only after they've literally destroyed themselves that they understand that they really loved each other. So it's a grown-up story. It's not a sexy Elizabeth Taylor story. Although I got to say that Amina Edris, our Cleopatra, certainly, she can put on the steam when she needs to. And the first couple of scenes are really, really just wonderful, and they are sexy. But it's really a story, a very complex and extremely modern story about older people and the complications of love and power.
Well, right from the start in that first scene, there's a sense of sort of lived life. I mean, Antony can barely get out of that scoop-shaped bed. There's a kind of weary past hanging there right from the start.
I had no problem writing that scene. It's very, very familiar.
Should we cite your age at this point, John?
Yes, yeah, right. And I imagine this scene with Antony just, very hungover, and Cleopatra coming in and just, giving him a really hard time. Elkhanah has decided to populate the opening of that scene with a lot of people, which kind of shocked me the first time. But I was amused by the fact that not only Elkhanah, but our dramaturg Lucia Schechner and our stage designer Mimi Lean, they're all young mothers. They all have little kids, and they recognize the fact that Antony and Cleopatra had children together. And that's not mentioned in the Shakespeare. I mean, he alludes to the son that Cleopatra had years before with Julius Caesar, but there's no mention of the fact that there are little kids running around. And I think only a young mother would think of that. So it's quite a shock, I think, to people to have this opera open and there are these two little kids running around. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, that sort of yellow sun on that first scene also. It's sort of a visual hangover right from the start, and the complications of it. the play has what, 40 scenes, 42 actors, some, a number would have filled the globe to overflowing. How did you decide what stayed in and what stayed out? I'm sure that's a very long discussion, but I mean, sort of broadly, what were the principles that guided the sort of shearing away and preserving of the play?
Well, I did a first draft of the libretto very early on, almost 5 years ago, and it was just wildly different. I had imagined there would be a quartet, 4 singers who would sing this kind of wry verse that I had made up, sort of doggerel, and describe each scene. So it was more kind of Brechtian, and I was at the time influenced by the Mahagoni Songspiel by Kurt Weill.
These were going to be non-Shakespearean. These was a sort of an extra.
Yeah, and then I was going to use Shakespeare, but fortunately, I got into the company of Elkhanah and Lucia Schechner, and they saved me from a terrible idea. And I have a wonderful picture, which I think is maybe in the program book, of this meeting that the 3 of us had in my home here. We have a very, very large dinner table, and on that table was butcher paper with, it seems like 1,000 Post-its, and Elkhanah and Lucia had made a flow chart of this play, and we basically spent 2 days saying, okay, we don't need that, we don't need that, we don't need that, we can use that, we don't need that. And I think really we ended up with what to me is an extremely satisfying libretto, which focuses on essentially on these 3 characters: the young Caesar, who in my mind has been kind of a Mark Zuckerberg. He's just, everything he does is right. He has no sense of humor. He's always on message. And, Antony and Cleopatra.
No raised voices over, oh no, we've got to have that stay in. Oh no, that's got to go out. Any horse trading go on?
There was definitely some back and forth about the character of Enobarbus and how were we going to resolve his arc, because he's, such a crucial figure and he dies in a ditch unsung. And so we were trying to figure out how to sort of resolve what happens when they break up, because it's sort of the last, his last lifeline, Antony's is really Enobarbus in terms of his old culture and his community and his support system.
Let's turn to talking about the production a little more specifically. I don't, spoiler alerts for folks who are listening in, but it will only entice you to have some discussion of what this amazing production is like. I mean, involves many elements. I actually want to talk about one scene, which Gesamtkunstwerk shouldn't be thrown around lightly, but there's a scene, I think it's Act 2, Scene 2, Caesar's Great Speech, which is just an extraordinary piece of stagecraft. The chorus is downstage, sort of chanting out their affirmation of this, the speech that's going on in a little window up above the stage floor. And the way the chorus merges with these sort of sepia tone newsreel footage, it's just an extraordinary piece of stagecraft. There are many, but I wonder if you could talk about how bringing those elements and also these sort of sliding panels that aperture in and out the way sort of old-fashioned movies did for scene wipes and scene changes, how some of that visual and sort of textural thinking went into this production, how that sort of evolved.
Sure. I mean, when we were initially talking about the subject of Antony and Cleopatra and talking about Hollywood and all of that, it felt pretty early on like I wanted to bring Bill Morrison on for the project. And Bill had collaborated with John and I on the Nixon and China at LA Phil. And it was the first time I'd seen archival footage used with John's music. And I thought that the marriage of those two, not all the time, but certainly at moments, was really a beautiful marriage. So I wanted Bill involved. And so I knew there'd be a filmic component, and we knew the newsreel was going to be helpful in terms of collapsing a lot of these events that we'd cut and toggling between the private scenes and the public persona. And so all of that coalesced in knowing that there would be this sort of, propaganda and media narrative coming out of Egypt and Rome. And then what you're describing in Act 2, Caesar's big speech, is really the culminating, peak of his ascension in terms of our, we've got the sort of collapse of the lovers and the rise of Caesar. And that's how the structure of the arc of the whole thing's going. And we didn't really find some of that crowd content coming into Act 2 was a bit of a later discovery. And then suddenly it was like, how are we going to merge live feed with him with a language of 30s newsreel and try to find an elegant solution instead of going like, Jumbotron with full color and pixelation like you would see, nowadays in a big stadium. So that's kind of how we made our way to that. And then in terms of the aperture, that was Mimi Lian, who the early prompt was, let's do sort of Hollywood, but not do Singing in the Rain on a soundstage, but sort of play with media as a sort of more metaphorical element without being so overtly making the set with the crew and the backdrops all sort of visibly present.
What is some of that archival footage? What is it exactly? Is it looks like newsreel footage? Is that what it is?
It is. Some of it's, as we started diving in all that, I started looking at YouTube at travel video from the 30s and 40s. And so Pathé out of Britain was an early resource. But even if you like Google, TWA in the 50s did, like traveling around Egypt, and there's these amazing, pans across Abu Simbel and into like sarcophagi at the museum, stuff that people wouldn't even really get to shoot now because of access. So, so that was really kind of opened it up, was to sort of start looking at travel log content. And then the big Piazza della Repubblica was the last prince of Italy's wedding, I think in 1938 or something like that.
Are there any rights issues with using those things, or can you?
That's all Bill Morrison. He's the one who knows about all of that.
He and the lawyers. John, with 8 previous operas in your pocket or whatever, I wonder how much you are involved in sort of the visual conception and how you contribute and how you inform the way this production or other productions for that matter look and feel on stage, how they're realized in 3 dimensions.
I just do the music, and hopefully if I'm working with really imaginative collaborators, they take what I give them musically and then combined with what the story is and how to tell it. Beyond that, I'm not involved, and it's always a thrill if I have in this case, I just think what Elkhanah and Mimi Lian did was just brilliant. The stage is so fluid that we could start out in a bedroom, and you really feel you're in a bedroom, and then just in a matter of seconds, we're in Rome with, suddenly there's this, marble white pediment and Caesar's office, and then that goes to, the I guess the next thing is the newsreel, where we see this archival footage, and that flows into a scene where Cleopatra and her maids are sitting around a pool drinking daiquiris. It's just amazing what they did. I think it's kind of one of the most brilliant pieces of stagecraft I've seen.
I agree. It's really something. And one of the effects of the newsreel footage to me, and the sort of panning, is that in moving back and forth between Rome and Alexandria, Egypt and Rome, we move not only geographically, and we feel that movement, those panning shots over the desert and the dunes, and the shots of those tight shots of Italy and Rome, but it feels like we're moving in time as well. And I just wonder about your sense of temporally, how your sense of time plays into your whole conception of how this opera is working, or you hope it is.
I wish I could give you a nice packaged answer, but when I'm composing, I just have a very vague mental image, and I wouldn't even describe the image that I have, because it's often very vague, and it's nothing like what Elkhanah or Peter Sellers would come up with, and that's part of the thrill of being an opera composer, because you do something and then you give it to somebody else, and they show you what their image is, and it's usually completely different. And if you're working with really brilliant people, it's just a thrill.
I just want to pause here for a moment and invite those who are looking in, if they'd like to participate in the chat room and post a question or a comment or something. We're happy to look at them. So just, Elkhanah, let me follow you up on that again. The sense of the opera sort of floating in time a little bit. Was that kind of your intention to an extent?
Wow, I don't know. I mean, it's funny because public and private, and all the world's a stage, and the stage of sort of the public life and the manufacturing of image and all those things. I mean, Shakespeare is grappling with all these huge themes, and he definitely is not doing unification of time and place, right? He's sort of
right.
And so we're bouncing all over the place. We've consolidated a ton of missives down, and one messenger emerges as sort of a character we can track through. So I guess all I do is I just follow the music. I mean, it's just like the ride that John creates musically is the thing that I try to illuminate. And sometimes there's a transition and it's 15 seconds, and other times it's 2 minutes, and so there's whatever those parameters are is what I try to activate. That's really the goal.
Were there moments in the opera, scenes in the opera, things that were technically or aesthetically challenging for you in terms of staging this?
Yeah, there's a funny moment, because we did have 15 seconds to transition from Caesar with Agrippa in Rome back to the throne room of with Cleopatra. And it starts with a few little quiet harp notes, and it's literally only 15 seconds. And so it was like we ran that aperture move over and over again, trying to get it to be just right to sort of swipe and reveal. And it was like, if only we had 10 more seconds of music, it'd be fantastic.
Now, I gave you several fermatas.
It's true. But anyway, yeah, that was a fun moment to try to get, and we finally got it literally right before opening night. In terms of other challenges, I think it was that Mimi created this really wonderful series of objects that can do cool things, and then it was a matter of really how to play out those cards in the appropriate order so that we're revealing the depth and the connectivity between these, this giant unit that flips between Egypt and Rome.
Yeah, and in addition to these apertures, we should say about the production, they're also built sets sort of behind that. There's a sense of Egypt's enormous scale that we only see a kind of a slice of, that implies the scope of the pyramids and things of that sort. That I thought that was a particularly cunning use of visual imagery as well.
Great. Yeah, that was Mimi bringing sort of in the ancient, research in terms of these civilizations and how they express, manifest destiny and their universal peace and all of that. So, yeah.
John, you wrote the lead roles, the title roles for Gerald Finley and for Julia Bullock, who could not participate because of the good news of her pregnancy. How was it to sort of, for Amina to step into that role? What was that like for you, just in terms of having conceived a role for one voice and having it played by someone else, one performer, that is?
Well, I like to compose with a particular performer in mind. And, when I go back to those early Ingmar Bergman films from the early 60s, and I see the same characters, Max von Sydow and Harriet Anderson, in one film and then in another, I understand how important it is to have a particular person in your mind, just in terms of the creative flow. Obviously, someone else is going to sing this and will bring different talents to this. But, I had Julia in mind, and Julia's an exceptional artist. All of the characters, all the character qualities of Cleopatra, she can do. She can do narcissist. She can do, angry bitch. She can do, this brilliant Machiavellian a woman who literally is holding her empire together, and she can do, a vulnerable woman who's desperately in love. And when Julia had to bow out, I was freaked out for a month because I just, at this point, I think this was like March of this year, and all of the good sopranos were busy off, they were singing in Salzburg or the Met or whatever. And the San Francisco Opera told me about this young woman who, just as a sideline, happened to be born in Cairo, which seemed almost too good to be true. And I, at first, was very anxious because she had no experience doing contemporary opera at all. But I met with her, Amina Edris. I met with her when I was conducting in Cincinnati. She flew down from Toronto, where she was singing Mimi in Traviata, and I immediately got this sense that this was a really feisty, determined young woman who could do this. And it turns out, and I'm sure that Elkhanah will agree with me, she is a phenomenally gifted actress. And so is Jerry. He's an amazing actor. So just right from the start, as soon as Elkhanah started working with him, it just became this fantastic kind of electrical energy, and I just love watching Amina on the stage.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about those repertory companies, actors like, artists like Moliere, who wrote for a company of actors, or Bergman, as you say. Of course, actors go on playing Moliere for hundreds of years afterwards, as just as singers go on singing roles afterwards. We have a bunch of questions in the chat, but before we get to a few of those, I wanted to ask you, John, about some of the orchestral writing in this piece. You've called it your most actively dramatic work, and there's a kind of forward thrusting quality to the music. And I wonder, and the color of it, particularly those dark, low, the trombones work hard, especially in the first act. And then it struck me the other night that the texture, really the orchestral texture changes to something more yearning and more plaintive in the second act. Am I capturing your intention in any way there?
Yes, absolutely. The first act is, it has a lot of different emotions and things going on. The first scene is kind of, back and forth, a little bit of banter, some lovemaking, some harassment between Antony and Cleopatra. There's a second scene, which is what I call very data heavy. It's got a lot of words in it, and it has to set up the story. And then of course the act ends with this big battle scene. But Act 2 begins with the fact that both Antony and Cleopatra have had terrible defeats, and they are apologetic to each other. And then Antony is gripped by this terrible suspicion that she's betraying him. So I needed to find a musical language, a musical atmosphere that could embody that energy between them. And then of course, the last half hour, or I haven't counted, maybe even 40 minutes of the opera is really quite tragic. And the music reflects it. I think it's some of the best music I've ever written in terms of just its lyricism.
There's a lovely effect. It must be Cleopatra. I can't remember exactly what the action is. It's later in the opera, of course, where there's a kind of a harp, repeated harp figure. It's almost like a ground bass, except
yes, exactly,
except played above as a kind of descant. It's really
right. Yeah,
very something. I'm going to have to loom in order to be able to read these chats, but let me. Someone asked, did either of you look at George Bernard Shaw's talks in Caesar and Cleopatra?
How about you, Elkhanah?
A little bit, but there was the Northrop and Fry and a ton. We did a bunch of. We ended up really, I think, drilling down on a lot of the real historical events. Looking at what the real facts were on donations of Alexandria and the Battle of Actium, and all of the events that are named in the Shakespeare, and actually how well researched Shakespeare was in the writing of the play. He clearly did a ton of research to prepare for his play.
you could get lost in the weeds if you tried to read everything about Antony and Cleopatra.
Yeah, that's true.
I think the Bernard Shaw play is really about a teenage Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, not about this story.
Right. Yeah. There's a long narrative there. Someone, Shane Thorne, is asking, do you have any advice for composers who are trying to write opera in today's musically theatrical climate? I'm sure you get asked the "Do you have any advice?" question a lot, and here it is again.
What can I say? It's so complicated. Every composer has to find his or her opportunity. The one thing I can say is that in 6 years in university, music classes and composition classes with, prize-winning professors, no one ever told me a thing about singing. We never discussed the voice. We never discussed how to write for singers. And I had to learn that, as we say in the school of hard knocks. Only the problem was the hard knocks weren't for me. They were for the poor singers who were having to negotiate my vocal writing. But I would say, if you're going to write opera, let's first of all learn about how the human voice works, how to write for voice.
And how did you learn that? How did you acquire that facility?
I did it by, making a million mistakes and hearing singers, struggle and finding, how to make it right, and then, studying Schumann songs and Mozart arias and Verdi, but mostly just through, experience. I read several biographies of Verdi while I was composing this opera. And the thing that struck me the most was that he spent most of his life in the theater. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean it literally, in the building. So you know what he was doing there. He was trying something out and saying, no, that sounds awful. That leap is too wide. This, you got to take a breath here. I mean, just really nuts and bolts stuff.
And you have to learn that from singers too. I assume you learned a lot from singers saying, no, I can't sing that, John. That line just isn't, that's just not going to work.
Yes, well, I'm sure, if I wasn't in the room, their language would have been much more purple.
Someone else is asking a little bit more about sort of the Hollywood aspect. We kind of brushed over that a little bit, but let's talk a little bit about, as we start to run out of time here, about how Hollywood informed the Hollywood sort of the 30s, really, isn't it? That sort of informed the way this production looks and feels. Elkhanah, what? Yeah,
I mean, I think one of the things, why that era, and because we even talked about as a design team, why would cell phones live in this world? And the answer is patently no, because the idea of who controls the narrative, who can fund and support, transmitting with giant cameras and the cost. That's where the sort of golden age of Hollywood and the screen gods and goddesses comes from. And also, the idea that everything was in print or radio and you could go to the theater and escape and walk in at any time and get your news, but also, see faces writ larger than anywhere in human history. Because if you look at the trajectory of portraiture and even like the commissioning of painting of faces, starting with the hieroglyphs moving forward, I mean, you've got statuary that's big, but nothing that big, right? With the advent of photography and how that replaced a lot of portraiture. You blow up somebody's face like Marlene Dietrich onto the big screen and it's as big as it gets. And so that was very much a part of this sort of public persona and an age in which, it wasn't fractured, because the minute cell phones hit the scene and everyone became a filmmaker and siloing and social media and echo chambers and everybody sort of fracturing the hierarchy, those were all things that did not seem appropriate given the total control that these leaders had in terms of their image.
Yeah, well, in addition to the sort of the visual, the filmic imagery and the projections, that scene was mentioned earlier about Cleopatra poolside. It could be at the, it could be at a Beverly Hills hotel in 1937.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's very much a kind of a wonderful visual joke.
My image for that scene, Cleopatra's lying on a chaise lounge with her sunglasses and I got, what is it, a daiquiri or a martini or whatever?
Yeah, martini.
My mental image when I was setting that, there's a really hysterical movie with Catherine Zeta-Jones and George Clooney called Intolerable Cruelty. And Catherine Zeta-Jones, is one of these serial divorcees who keeps marrying old wealthy men and then divorcing them. And there's this one very funny scene where she's sitting around a pool with several other women and they're all in their white robes with their sunglasses on, talking about how they just drained some other millionaire's bank account.
So all sorts of resonance in this. I know this is a ridiculously premature question, but I'll ask it anyway. This is a co-production and a co-commission with the Met and with an opera company in Barcelona as well. What, once the run is finished here, not only what happens next, although we'd like to know that when the Met will be presenting this, if they're next, and how you think about sort of going to the next venue, and are you already thinking about things that, oh, we might rethink this here or rework this there?
Well, from my point of view, I have a lot of things first of all, we'll have Julia as Cleopatra, so that's a totally different personality, and it will be a different orchestra, an orchestra that doesn't know my music, and it will be a different conductor. It will be me conducting, so you know, I'll be able to shape the piece in a different way. I mean, Unsung Kim has set the bar very, very high for any future conductor. I mean, she just knows the piece, and she's just a brilliant opera conductor. But I love to, you know, I don't like to conduct my premieres, but I like to conduct it afterwards because, you know, when I have hands-on experience, I discover things and make changes. As in terms of the shape of the opera, I can't say. You know, right now it feels pretty good. Some people are complaining that, you know, it maybe winds down a little slow at the end, and I'm not sure if that's really the case. I usually have to make those decisions 6 months or a year afterwards. I don't know how Elkhanah feels about that, but maybe she can tell us.
I mean, I would say in terms of certain physical aspects of the production itself, there are some things that I think, you know, we would want to explore and figure out how to integrate a little bit more in some of the future productions. Mimi had conceived of a glossy black floor for the production that would have been reflective, and it was too hard to do with the big, giant, heavy monoliths moving around. I would just tear it up. And so I'd like to look at technically things like how to bring that back. And yeah, there's things like that. There's sort of a wish list. And certainly having a different Cleopatra is going to be a whole new journey, really, in terms of exploring. And I'm very excited to see how it works with John conducting. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon. And we're also still in the very nascent phase of launching the project here in San Francisco.
Exactly. I'm sure there's 8,000 things we haven't talked about. What is salient that we haven't touched on that you'd like to tell folks about?
I guess I'd love to just add that I think there's how to say this, like there's a real deep appetite for transformative storytelling that hits on topics of social justice and relevance, and making sure that various voices are at the table. And I think in terms of the composite of the people who are working on this, you will see that that's very much present. And I also sort of ask the bigger question of what, in terms of reflecting back to society as a mirror, you know, is art's function, and grappling with the big DNA of epic stories and myths that are beyond sort of the flashpoint of kind of a popular sentiment in culture at the micro moment, is something that I'm quite passionate about, and I think even more so having embarked on tackling this project.
Wow, it sounds like we need another hour. We're just getting started. John, you were about to say something as well.
Yeah, I first of all wanted to say, you know, there's something about opera that prods people into very violent opinions, you know, whether they're music critics or you know, people in the audience. Their expectations are so high. And, you know, the pressure to theoretically get it right the first time is enormous. And I have to remind people, I even had to remind the cast of this, that, you know, this is as we say, a work in progress. It took 5 years to get Nixon and China into a mode that really satisfied me. It took equal amount of time with Dr. Atomic. I think that this is one of the most confident and well-prepared premieres that I've ever experienced, but the piece will grow, and it is, you know, it's a living, breathing, you know, tissue. It's something that's going to change over time. And as far as relevance, I'm amused because, you know, people are so desperate that they're taking, you know, Traviata and putting it in Las Vegas, or, you know, they're taking, you know, Fidelio and putting it in, I don't know what, San Quentin or something like that to make it relevant. And, you know, we've sort of done the opposite. We've taken a very old story and we've set it to contemporary music and contemporary staging, and found in the story and the incredibly shaded and complex personal relationships and political relationships, I think we've found a story that is intensely contemporary and impacts our lives every bit as much as any other staging.
John Adams, Elkhanah Pulitzer, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to where Antony and Cleopatra go from here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.